Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Streaming Alchemy Show. On today's show, we're going to be taking a look at lighting for your studio. So, lighting is something that there's a lot of different dimensions to, and it would be hard to cover everything in just one show. But the key things we're going to talk about today will be different elements that make up lighting. So, everything from, how the light color looks to how bright and how diffuse that light is when it reaches whatever you're illuminating with it in a studio. Uh, we're also going to, though, take a more practical look at how you would set lights up in a studio, how you want to go about illuminating somebody in a video set, and then take a quick look at how we actually, in the Streaming Alchemy studio, set up our lights to make a really flexible, what we call a light pole, that covers all of our needs and gives us the flexibility to rearrange our studio as we need it. So I just want to remind everybody, as usual, that we will be accepting video call in today. You can just connect to the URL at the bottom, and somebody from the studio can get you on. We had our first live caller last week, which was great and ended up in a really great conversation. So I encourage everybody watching, please join us. It would be a lot of fun to have you be part of the show with us. We also, of course, welcome any comments in the comment section. So, however you'd like to participate, that's great. Love to have you on board. So, uh, something that we've been doing is each show we're asking a question for the show. And so today's question is, are you using LED lights in your studio? And this is a yes or no question, but this is really contrasting to, are you using LED lights versus more incandescent sources or fluorescent sources of light? So just answer yes or no in sort of the community space on, whatever portal you're viewing this on. And that would help us learn more about you. So why don't we get started? To begin this, I want to talk a bit about the nature of light, because this is important without getting too physicsy. So let me show this picture here. Uh, what I'm looking at here is something called light temperature, the color temperature of light. Now, if you look across this image, you'll see the light to the left are much warmer looking, so yellowish and reddish looking on the left-hand side of the picture. And the lights on the right-hand side are sort of the blues and the violets, very cool colors in the color palette. So the color that a light emits, sort of is the white light of that light, is called its color temperature. So color temperatures, range on a scale from 1,000 to 10,000, and what they're measured in is something called kelvins. Uh, Kelvin is a temperature measurement that's used in a lot of science, uh, and where it comes from is that if you took a piece of black metal and heated it up, what temperature would you have to heat it to for it to glow this specific color? So if I heated something up to 1,000 degrees Kelvin, you'd get that sort of yellowish light. But if I moved across and heated it up to 10,000 degrees, that would be the white hot, that blue white glow that metal gives off when it gets superheated. So this made sense as a gauge for the light temperature, the color temperature of a light, because most lights were actually done through heated filaments and other things in the past. With LEDs, the mechanism is less important, but the concept of light color, light temperature is still really critical. So let me just show you something here. I have this LED panel. It's sort of a 10-inch by 10-inch LED panel, and it has the ability to adjust the color temperature that it emits. So let me just sort of stick this over here so we can show this off here. So I don't want anything falling in the middle of the demo here. So here we go. Let me turn this around. So I think we got a camera over here we can use to see this. So if you look here, turn this on. I have two knobs here. One is for intensity. That's how bright the light is, and that's something we'll get to shortly. And I have another, which is for the color temperature. So if you look at this number now, it's 32, which is 3200. So on that scale we showed, the light right now, which is sort of a yellowish, maybe you can see it off of here, it's sort of a yellowish looking light. That is the color temperature that's very cool in terms of temperature, but very cool in terms, but very warm in terms of look. So you get this very yellowish look at 3200. And then I can adjust this up, and the light now will move up and change in character to now a much more sort of white blue light. And we use this color temperature, the 5600, as our temperature in the studio, which is why it looks white when I show it. But this is, really the other end. So most in commercial cases and studios, most of the time, even though the scale runs from 1,000 to 10,000, you're going to get something that sits in the range of 3,000 to 6,000. So most lights you have will come in that range. So let me shut this off for a second because there's something important. These types of lights that allow you to vary the color temperature are called bicolor lights. And one of the things to be aware of is that when you have a light that can work across a range of colors, the way this operates, so let me open this up here and show you. This light, even though it had a diffusion panel there, let me turn this around better so you can get a better view here. Uh, what we actually have here are individual LEDs that were sitting behind that diffusion panel. And half of these LEDs are 5600 Kelvin color temperature, and the other half are the 3200 color temperature. And the way it mixes the light is that it dims or brightens the corresponding set of LEDs to give that sort of mixed color temperature coming out from this light. But the key thing is, if I turn it all the way up to 5600 Kelvin, only half the LEDs are lit because I don't need anything else supplementing it to sort of make some sort of mix. So I only get half the light output, the full light output at 5600 or at 3200 as I would if I set it somewhere in the middle. So when you look at different lights, especially if you're looking at bicolor lights, it's very important to keep in mind the amount of lighting you will need based on the color temperature you select. So I guess, the obvious question in all this, let me see if I can just slide this back in here. The obvious question in all of this, of course, is what does it matter? Why do I care what color temperature is being used here? And sort of the simple answer is that it really doesn't. But what is important is that you be consistent. All of the lights that you have in a studio should all be the same color temperature. So as I said, for us, we use 5600 Kelvin, and that's sort of all the lighting we have. But it really doesn't matter as long as you have consistency. But the other piece to that consistency is it's really the way cameras operate. There's a concept in when you set up all your cameras, video cameras, even still photography cameras, there's a concept called white balance. And white balance is basically your way to tell the camera if there's light bouncing off of a white surface, what is the color temperature of that light? So it knows to make that your pure white color, and then it can get the correct colors for everything else. If you set it wrong, so if you had your camera set for sort of daylight and you were using very warm colored lights, the 3200K lights, everything would look yellow. And if you had your white balance set for the 3200 and you use daylight lights, everything would look very blue. So again, you have to, it's not just the lights that need consistency. You'll have to tell your camera what color temperature your lights are so it can capture the image correctly. Most cameras can do that automatically. It'll be something called AWB, auto white balance. So it doesn't take a whole lot to make that happen. Sometimes you have to set it manually, and you should be aware of that. Now, while I say you should use the same lighting consistently. Oh, Brad, how are you? Good to see you. Uh, so even though I talk about using the same lighting consistently, uh, Marty, good to see you. One of the key things to keep in mind is you can still make artistic choices that leverage different color temperatures. So, for instance, if you wanted somebody in the foreground to have sort of the warmer colored lights, the 3200K lights on them, but use to light your backdrop, uh, 5600, 5600K lighting, you could do that to give a bluer cast and still have a warm sort of light palette across your talent. So you can do it for artistic reasons, but be very aware that you are doing it and you're doing it knowingly for a specific aesthetic reason that you want to bring out in a shot or a set that you're putting together. So something to really keep in mind as we go through this. So enough on color temperature because there's a lot more to cover. Uh, the next thing I want to talk about is the brightness of a light. Uh, so if you think of your typical sort of light bulb, uh, you're used to seeing them, and they'll say 60 watt and whatever. That's really not particularly useful because that's telling you how much energy it burns. Uh, but it emits a certain amount of light, and it emits that light in all directions. So when you screw this bulb in that entire dome of light that's coming out, the power, the energy of that light is going out in all those different directions. So this total energy is something that's called luminous flux, which is a real sciency kind of term. But what you probably will see it represented as is lumens. How much light in total is being output from this lighting source? And this is something you'll find like if you go buy your light bulbs at your big box store or whatever, it'll have a lumens rating on the side. So it's something that is falling more into common usage as a way to measure how bright a light is. But when it comes to video, I don't really care about the light all around the bulb. Uh, that's good for how do I light a large space, and you may care about it in that broad context. But typically, if I'm trying to direct light, I'm interested in the light that actually hits the target that I'm trying to illuminate. So, if you look at that, what you're really starting to look at now is you're looking at the light that's moving in a single direction. And there is a measurement term for that as well. So it's called luminous intensity. And what that is, it basically looks at a point of light going out at a certain angle in a certain, basically like a cone. It's almost like an ice cream cone that just keeps extending out. It's the amount of light energy that's being emitted within that particular conical angle that's going out of light. And this is very often in the production space called candelas. It's how much light is making it onto a specific target that you're trying to illuminate. So these are just terms that are good to know as you think about, buying the lighting that you're going to use, and people may be asking you questions around this. So this should give you a sense where lumens really don't tell you as much in terms of the light that will get on a target. Candelas are really what you're interested in when it comes to that is your light intensity. The other thing, when we talk about this light getting onto a subject, is the color quality. So this is something that isn't as obvious. I mean, when you think of it, so I get the right color temperature and, it's bright enough and it's well lit. But that's not everything. If you think about light, if you've ever held light, shown a light through a prism, what you notice is that you see a whole spectrum of colors open up out the other side. And so that white light that you're shining on something is actually made up of a whole set of individual colors that are all combined. And that combination of colors is what allows you to see the colors on things. So, without being too geeky here, what happens is things either reflect colors or they absorb colors. The colors they absorb, the frequencies of light they absorb, you don't see. The colors they reflect off of them, you do see. So the reason you see something as red or green is it's reflecting red or green light to you. Now, color quality is really important because of this sort of attribute of light. If the reds or the greens or the blues in a spectrum of light that's put off by a certain light you bought are poor, you may not have great red color rendering or great green color rendering. And this is very important because you stop getting true colors if the light source doesn't really have a full spectrum of light. So this quality of light is called the color rendering index. And for almost any type of serious use, the color rendering index, or CRI, which is probably the way most people talk about it, you should have a CRI of 95 or above. And the good thing is the price of lights that actually have that capability have come way down. So there are a lot of relatively affordable options for lighting that are that high quality. But if you sort of look at the diagram that I have here, if you go down the spectrum to lower CRIs, you can really see how the color representation of these objects is deprecated. I mean, till you get to the sort of CRI 60 side, where they really almost look like they're being desaturated, almost going sort of half grayscale looking. So the quality of the light, the CRI, is another very important attribute for how you will pick out the lights for your studio. So the next thing I want to talk about is something that's kind of obvious, but it actually has some math behind it that you're going to need to at least understand to make use of, and that is how light falls off. So if I'm in a large auditorium and I hold up a light bulb, everything around that light bulb gets illuminated, but the further away you get, the dimmer it becomes until there are certain points in this large auditorium where there's no light shining at all. You can't see anything. So we know that light intuitively, we know that light just doesn't go on forever. I can't light one bulb and an entire room becomes bright. Uh, so this property of light is called fall off. And it actually follows something called the inverse square law. So without too much math, what the inverse square law basically says is that if I have a light source at a certain brightness, every time I double my distance from that light source, I only get a quarter of the light from that. So if I start at, in this diagram R, and then I double that, at 2R, the brightness of that light is a quarter of what it was at for somebody standing at R in this diagram. And that keeps going. So light continues to fall off using the inverse square law. So, well, this, seems like, okay, wow, this now I got to get more lights because I have a bigger space to light. That's true. But having the ability to have that light fall off gives you the ability to control where it hits. So when you want to illuminate something, but keep something else in more of a shadow space, you now have the ability to do that. So it's important both in terms of how you deploy lights, but also in terms of understanding how much light you're going to need to illuminate the set you want to illuminate for a production. So that's, sort of the end of the geeky piece of this. And I'd really like to dive now into more of how you use light inside a studio to illuminate your production. So the first thing when you start to think of things in terms of the aesthetic is that light doesn't stand alone. There's sort of this yin and yang. There's light and there's shadow. And this is not a philosophical discussion. This is really more of a practical discussion of how you use light when you light things in a studio. Getting something to look clearly lit so you can see everything on it is very important. But having enough shadow on something is also important because it adds definition and depth to things. Things that are flatly lit, like evenly lit across the entire space, are going to look bland, flat, uninspired. And by having some shadow in those things, you're now going to have something that pops a little bit more, that has a little bit more form and presence in a scene that you're lighting. So the reason this is our eyes are used to looking at contrast. So unless you have those types of contrast, you don't get to spot these things as easily. And it requires more attention to sort of pull out details. So it's important to have both. So we're really working with both as we do things. So when we think of shadows, there are really two types of shadows that you have. So let me sort of jump here. If we go lights in the studio, so this first example is something that's called hard shadows. So there's a light over here, usually from a small source. So if you look at this light sort of coming in across this diagram, uh, it's casting a very solid looking shadow on each of these from each of these objects. So it's almost like you could take and draw a pencil line around this and capture that shape of the object on the ground. So, well, this has a lot of sort of hard definition in it, very clean edges. It isn't necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing form of lighting. So, you can also have something that's called soft shadows. And in soft shadows, the edges of the shadow become diffuse, sort of very ill defined and soft, for lack of a better term for it. So this adds a lot more depth and aesthetic beauty, uh, while still capturing all the same information that was actually caught in this case with hard shadows. Now, again, it's an aesthetic choice, and there may be reasons you want to use hard shadows sometimes, but this is sort of the two types of ways with light and shadow can interplay that can really make a difference for how a scene would look for you. So, the way you get hard shadows is by having a light source relatively close to a subject and sort of shining directly on them. So, if you look at this picture, and my apologies for the choice of model in this, uh, you'll see that there is a pretty clear line between where the shadow starts and where the illuminated part of the face is. And that's because this light is just coming over, and as soon as it hits anything that blocks it, it creates a really just a hard, solid line because it's all coming pretty much from one direction. But if I were to place something called a diffuser, some sort of fabric or some sort of gel that can take that light and have the beams sort of scatter around. So they're not coming at the subject straight anymore, but they're coming from a lot of different directions and effectively enlarging the size of the light because this screen now starts to become a big luminous object. The shadows now become much softer here. So you can see there is no sort of hard outline anymore for where the light's hitting. And that's really, an important thing because it's much flattering to people in terms of how they look on camera to have more soft, diffuse light with soft, diffuse shadows. So when you light people, though, you typically are going to light them from different directions. So the common thing that we talk about is something called three-point lighting. So in three-point lighting, you have a light that's called your key light, which illuminates one side of a person. And that key light will cast shadows on their other. So you then will place a light on that other side, and that's called the fill light. And the job of the fill light is to be dimmer than the key light, but just take away some of those harsher shadows that you may get there. And then the third point, the three-point lighting, is the lighting that goes behind the person. And so this light will typically be used to create some definition around their shoulder and the back of the neck, top of their hair, for what we have here, and give people, again, a better definition of the person and a little more depth to the person. This light and shadow and it's clarity and depth. This is sort of the whole thing when you light. It's ultimately an aesthetic choice. So let's go in though and look at what this would play out like as I light somebody for a production. So let me sort of go through here. So I went through this. So so here's an example where I have all the lighting set up. So I have a key light, which is shining the light on this side of the face. The fill light is taking in and filling in any of those shadows that may have been sitting over here. And then the backlight is the thing that's illuminating this part of the hair and this part of the shoulder here to create that separation from the background. And you can actually see the difference, how much flatter this side looks without the backlight on it compared to the shoulder and this arm with the backlight on it. So you can just see from there the difference it makes. But let me break this down. So if I just had the key light, this is the lighting that you're going to see. So not particularly flattering, fairly harsh. There's a lot of shadow on the other side, so you don't really get to see the person, fully. And you basically have the same very flat look around the person situated against the backdrop. So the fill light, which is the other light, you can see now when I just have that light on, it's much dimmer, but it is basically filling in the shadows that the key light was casting. So when I put these two together, this is the key and the fill. And you can see it hasn't done anything to create that separation with the backdrop, but it's still something that is much, much better looking than you'd get from just sort of one hard light coming in or flat lighting where these would be at the same intensity. So let's look at the backlight. So this is sort of the spooky type of shot you get, but this is exactly what you see happening now. These edges are illuminated, the hair is illuminated, a little bit of the shoulder over here. So again, that rim you really see here, and that's another name for these lights, they're called rim lights as well. That rim of light that you get around the back of a person that you're trying to illuminate. So when you have the back and the fill, you now sort of start to see the definition of the person coming in. And now we're back with all the lighting in place. So this hopefully will give you a sense of where you want to position lights, uh, in terms of, illuminating different subjects. If you have multiple people that are going to be on a set, you need to look at how do you accomplish these same basic things with multiple people on a set. So this could be done sometimes by having lights, but also having things that are called like bounce cards or reflectors. You can just take white poster board and stick it in a location so the light that's coming from this side gets bounced off of that white poster board and can be used to fill in shadows. And there are all different types of pop-up products and those that can do that. So it can be a way to add that extra light while still only buying one physical light in your set. But when you work with multiple people, it can be difficult. So sometimes you need to be bouncing light off of ceilings or walls to create that type of separation and have multiple lights to make sure everybody has sort of a key and fill at some level shining on them. But this is a case, understand now, where the fall off of light can help you. Because if you have two people in a setting and you have something on one side of the person that's sort of closer to this location, that light that's hitting them is going to be brighter than the light that hits this other person that's further away. So you can effectively create key and fills on different sides for different people. You could have sort of key lights on the outside and the spill from those lights hitting the opposite person act as the fill. So there are things you can do as you start to look at lighting people to accomplish this without having to buy, three lights for everybody and figuring out how to, do all of the, gaffing you need to hang the lights and position them, outside of a frame. So a lot of creative things you can do with the lights you have to accomplish this type of lighting setup. So I think, the other thing is, where do these lights go? So that's something that a lot of people talk about. there's no hard fast rule. I mean, typically what most people will do is they'll go 45 degrees each side, one side key, one side fill, and they'll usually pick over one shoulder, almost sort of like a 270, sort of opposite the the fill light, which will be what they use for a rim light. You're not stuck with that. That's nothing close to a hard and fast rule. You really are going to make an aesthetic choice. You can light the person, and based on how they look, uh, that would be. Uh, oh, yeah, Brad. I know. There's more. There's more gear. Brad just mentioned that it's time to visit Amazon again, and I definitely understand that that impulse. I think the key thing though is there's a lot of things you can do with the lights that you have available, and or with some very low cost lights. There are things that Lowe's or Home Depot that can work very well for doing lighting with a little bit of clever rigging. And the other thing that we talked about is diffusion. Putting diffusers in front of lights that are decent quality lights in terms of their light output, even if they're very inexpensive, can be great for doing a starting setup for what you want, especially if you're using them in conjunction with other lighting. So if you want to do lighting that's like a rim light or a backlight, that sort of thing, you don't have to be as fussy about the quality and color, the CRI of those types of lights. So you have more flexibility there too. But I understand the point though, where there's a lot of things that go into sort of building out a set. Uh, so the distance for the lights, it should be out of frame. So clearly, our lights are probably somewhere around, probably about 6 feet on this side and about 8 feet on this side for me. So, slight differences. But you really are just trying to figure out where you get enough light without blowing out the highlights, getting those sort of bright spots on people's usually foreheads, uh, where it just looks like a shining white spot and there's no definition. So it's really dialing it in. For everything that you can do. And you can get light meters and do all those types of things to dial things into specific ratios. At the end of the day, it's an aesthetic choice. Dial it in for what looks good. And not just to you, but looks good to your camera. So as you think about what you're shooting, it's all coming through the camera. So that's really critical here for you. Make sure it looks good in your camera, and then it's going to look good when you stream it to your audience. So all right. So let's get into something a little more hands on. Uh, when we set up the studio, one of the things we wanted was something that was fairly flexible, where we could move things around without having to do sort of major wiring changes all the time, and without having to really think too much about it. If we wanted to make a choice to try something, we could do that. It wasn't a major commitment in time. So, what we ended up doing, lighting was probably one of the big pieces of this for us. So, what we ended up doing is we built these lighting poles that we actually really like for the types of things we do. And so, let me go over here. Uh, so, this will give you a bit of a new shot that we have here. So, everything that we've done with lighting is hanging on these things. This is a Manfrotto auto pole. There are other ones out there, slightly less expensive. These are probably about $125 for a pole. But what an auto pole does is they are an extendable pole that locks between the ceiling and the floor. So as you extend this, you can lock it in. And then when you pull this lever down, it ratchets it up to tighten it to the floor and the ceiling. Now, the great thing about using lights on these types of poles is that there's no stand around it. So, one of the big problems you end up with when you have a lot of light stands is they take up space on the ground, and you're always worried about people tripping on them, or getting cables caught as you move things around. So, this really eliminates it. And so, what we'd use to attach things to these poles are something called super clamps. And let me put this down. Oh, let me just put this down over here. So Super clamps are basically these little ratcheted. So if you see here, I have this ratchet. You can pull it out to move it. So if you get close to a wall with something, you can still always get leverage on it. Uh, we use this to clamp to the poles, and then we use these little pins that go in these super clamps. These pins here. Let me see if I can get this out. This is called a baby pin, and so it means when you search for them on Amazon, you get a whole bunch of interesting infant products as well. But there are multiple sizes of these pins that are designed primarily for lights and other types of, pole or uh, stand mounted attachments. So you get this, you can plug this in, and these baby pins will then be used to hang the light. So if you look on here, we have a connector up top that allows us to put this all together. So let me pick this up here. So if you look over here at what we have set up here, uh, this is pretty close to what we have. We have slightly different lights here, but we have a main light, and this is what we use typically as our key light shining on talent. We then have a secondary light that we place lower down. And the secondary light allows us to do a lot of different things. So if we need to position the pole further away for the way we're setting up something, it can actually just add more light to the scene. So you can get sort of a higher brightness coming in, which, can cover distance better. But in most cases, what we end up using this for is some sort of bounce light. So the great thing, because this pole is so flexible, is I can take and I could twist this light anyway. So I could turn this around. Like say I had a white wall here, I could take this around and adjust this light so it's turned up and shining off a wall. So now what I've created is sort of bounce light. I'm taking the main light coming here and using this bouncing light as a secondary light source. So it gives me now another option for creating sort of the soft lights that I may want around somebody. And I can also, because this is flexible, I could just detach this and put this higher up on the pole so I could bounce it off the ceiling if I wanted. So the other thing that we have on here, though, is this pole. And again, it attaches the same way using this type of clamp. But what we use this for is for hanging diffusion material. So let me show you over here. So we have this thing here. This is a white diffuser. It's one of those things that twist up, so you can just fold it up and open it up. They come in all different sizes. We use bigger ones in the studio typically. But all you need to do now is you can take this in front of the light, and now you've created a very soft light, diffuse light from this. The other thing, and this is the types of poles that we use here, you can actually extend this out. So one of the things that we didn't mention is the further that the light source is from a diffuser, the more diffuse the light coming out the other side will be, because this light here is spreading out as it hits him, and then this will start to scatter that all over going out. So now you have the ability not just to dial in the lighting, but you can also dial in the diffusion that you want from this pole. And the great thing is it's so easy to move. The key to making it easy to move, though, is that when we put this together, we actually use an outlet on the base that has a switch on it. So we can light everything up, but then all the wiring for the lights stay on the pole. So nothing is on the floor, nothing is dangling or separate. It's all, each one of these clamps has whatever power brick is needed to light the light, and all the cables run to a power strip, which is zip tied to the base of the stand. So when I want to move the stand, I basically unplug it like a lamp, reduce the tension at the top, reposition it, and plug it back in. So it's very, very easy for us to deploy these where we need them exactly without a lot of hassle. And I think as you develop your own studios, that's going to be one of the key things. It has to be convenient. if doing things requires a lot of upfront effort, a lot of setup time, a lot of dial-in time, it's going to be much harder for you to go live. And I think that's the worst thing. It's much better to simplify your setup and to be able to go on air whenever you feel on a whim if you want to come in and just talk to people so you have that ability. So, hopefully, this gives you a better clue to how we set up our lighting here. Some of the things you can do with setting up lights for bouncing as well as diffusion. And again, having the portability to move things around based on the types of setups you're working with. So, I guess that probably covers everything I wanted to talk about today. So, hopefully, this was useful to everyone. We have, we were really excited about this because this was one of the things that really was a struggle for us when we started, was getting this right, and it's still not perfect. I mean, as you can tell, we have our issues with glare and other things that we're always trying to work on in the space we have, but it's something that can be really powerful as a sort of a tool for you. And knowing the theory that we talked about, sort of how light falls off and the quality of light that you get, and what you need to do with your camera and the light, that combined should give you a much more confident view to doing this lighting setup for yourself for what works for your studio. So before we jump off, I wanted to remind everybody that I will be speaking at the Stream Geek Summit, which is coming up this November in New York City. There are free online tickets, so if you want a virtual ticket to join, please go there and sign up. I think they're getting a really great lineup of folks, and it's pretty exciting because they are really focused on not making this a commercial thing like you get in a lot of these conferences where it's just people selling you stuff. I really believe this is going to be a conference focused on how do you really get started? How do you enhance your production? What are the tools, techniques that you need? Much more than trying to sell your gear. So this, I think, is going to be a really great show. And I I encourage everybody who could show up in person to come because I love to get the chance to meet everyone and to spend some time talking. But okay, so for our show next week, we're going to be looking at lenses. So uh, there's a lot that goes into creating different types of shots and how you set up the cameras in your studio. And a big piece of this is the lenses that you choose and how you set those lenses up. So that's what we're going to be talking about on next show. So thanks again, everybody. Great to have you join me today. Thanks for participating in the chats. That's always a lot of fun for me. And until next week, have a great one. Take care.